Okay.
Hello, and welcome to the series Meet the Advisors. I'm here today with my good friend, Jonathan, who's also an advisor of the Plant-Based Transition Coalition and Vegan Option Canada. So, Jonathan, why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Okay, great. Thanks, Soren. So, well, how do I start by introducing myself? I'm somebody who, like so many others of us, I'm interested in making a difference in the world, and in particular, I'm very focused on trying to reduce suffering of all sentient beings, which is something that a passion that I share with you and so many others. My background is actually in research, molecular biology. That's where I started my career. So I've always had kind of a scientific approach to solving problems and to understanding the world. And a few years ago, I founded a small organization called Opus, which you know because you're part of the team. Opus is the organization for the prevention of intense suffering. And yeah, we call it a think and do tank. And the goal is really to look for ways of effectively preventing intense suffering in the world, in the present and in the future. And again, the suffering of both humans and non-human animals. So we've been addressing both specific causes of suffering, in particular, human beings who are unable to access effective pain medication, and specifically people with end-of-life cancer who can't get morphine, and more recently, people with cluster headaches, for whom psychedelics would be a very attractive and powerful treatment option, but for legal reasons are often unable to obtain them. So it's basically lobbying and education work. We can discuss more about that. In addition, I write, not all the time, but I've written one book about ethics, and I've just finished writing another one, which I'm looking for a publisher at the moment. And it's really about getting at the root of this question: what matters, and how do we go about it? I mean, that's how I sort of talked about the first book, Battle for Compassion. How do we figure out what matters in this apathetic universe? That's part of the title of the book, where things just happen and complexity arises and people do nasty things to one another and to other inhabitants of the planet. And there's a lot of nastiness going on even without us. I mean, suffering, let's say, even without cruel intent. So how do we figure out what to do given this situation? And my new book goes, let's say, one step further in addressing the interplay between intuition and rationality in trying to figure out what to do, which is not a new, that in itself is not a new sort of insight or perspective. We know that the rationality and intuition tend to give us different kinds of solutions when faced with ethical dilemmas. But I'm trying to provide a little bit more insight into this whole issue of how there are these two levels of being in the world and understanding the world. The more intuitive human being that just wants to exist and to thrive and to reproduce and to be happy and not to do things that feel morally wrong. And then the more agent-like aspect of our existence, where we're actually trying to change the world, change the system, and have as much impact as we can on the things that matter. And these two perspectives can feel very different, and they can lead to very different conclusions. And this is one of the big issues, issues that arise when people who care about the world but have very different perspectives may find that they clash very much in what seem to be even fundamental values. You know, people who are good-hearted and want to have impact and dislike the whole industrial machine that is destroying our planet and the sentient beings that live on it. But they're very different ideas sometimes about how to go about solving things because there are different ideas about what the actual problem is. So, so yeah, this is one of the key themes of the new book I'm working on, which is tentatively titled "The Tango of Ethics." So this may be a brief introduction.
Thank you. So perhaps now, from your perspective, we could go into a brief situational assessment of the world. I know you've been doing some work around collapse, and I think it's a perspective that we can't not talk about when we're talking about affecting the world. So perhaps a bit from that perspective, but also just in general, from your perspective, like where are we at? Brief situational assessment. We're just coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, in my first book, The Battle for Compassion, I wrote towards the end of the book, I had well, some chapters that were more about looking towards the future, and one in particular called "Where We Are Headed." And I used the phrase or metaphor that it seems like humanity is coming up against a wall. That somehow the explosion of complexity and technology is leading us not necessarily towards an exponentially greater future, but towards some sort of wall or abyss or collapse or something, that things are not just going to continue as they are. For various reasons, and obviously climate change is one of the big, one of the major causes of change on our planet, causes of disruption, and but it's not just that; it's also resource depletion. It's the increasing inequality on our planet, and the use of technology by autocratic regimes to suppress the well-being of many of the inhabitants of their countries, the uncertainty of the future of democracy, and running out. Yeah, as I said, resource depletion, and that includes both material resources that we need to as the sort of materials from which we build our economy and our infrastructure and everything, and then of course energy sources that are renewable and not exhaustible. So yeah, these are all sort of common problems that we're aware of. And yeah, so I do feel that things are potentially deteriorating very quickly. You mentioned work on collapse. And this came about because I've been working with an old friend of mine, Jen Bendel, who, because I'm working on ethics, asked me if I would collaborate with him on a project to reflect on the ethics of climate, of civilizational collapse, and specifically, what are the implications of a collapse of our civilization, even the anticipation of this collapse happening and the experience of it happening to people's values. And so we just held a webinar last week with a group of people interested in this question professionally, really to map out what are the things that people are concerned about and how might people's personal values change. My interest in this work is partly a way to bring the whole suffering aspect into the conversation. The whole idea that of ethics being most essentially about suffering and about trying to alleviate it, which is not a framing that everybody uses. In fact, most people don't, but most people at the same time do care very much about suffering. And it's a way of, yeah, my interest is basically reminding people that I mean, collapse has two different aspects of it. There's the actual suffering that is caused due to collapse. There's potential suffering that we would like to avert in the future that we might not be able to do if we're not around, if humans are not around to continue on in that kind of in that role of agents. And then there's this existential issue of, you know, what does it mean for humans potentially to not be around on the planet for much longer, or at least in the form of a complex civilization, which is something which it may matter to me emotionally as an individual, but intellectually, I don't see that as having the same importance as the actual, let's say, intense, extreme suffering of sentient beings. So for me, suffering, when it comes down to it, it's suffering that is the essence of what I would like us to be focusing on, because well, essentially a future full of suffering is not a future, I think, that's worth having.
So let's.
But I mean, so I was talking about, you know, collapse here, but I mean, if you're talking more generally about the world, well, I mean, how do you sort of sum up the situation of our world in a minute? You know, it's such a complex situation, and I would say, you know, what one sort of simplified way of thinking about it is that on the one hand, we have this sort of increasing concentration of economic power in the hands of large corporations and individuals who have a lot of power over governments. So we have a real sort of dysfunctional situation also with the democratic process, as I was mentioning earlier, is put into question in countries like the US, where we have a country like China where there's a danger of having totalitarianism locked in, and potentially in other countries that could happen as well. So there are very worrying trends on the one hand. On the other hand, I think there is a certain amount of moral circle expansion, if you like, and especially I think younger people are more sensitive to the whole idea of suffering and oppression, and including the suffering of animals. So I think it's probably true that younger people are more likely to go vegan. It almost seems like the question is, will we have enough time before things get really bad to have some sort of a moral revolution, if you like? Maybe revolution is too strong a word, but you know, in the same way that social movements in the past have pushed through human rights, you know, typical examples being the abolition of slavery, the granting of right to vote to women. Will we see the same kind of revolution taking place in animal rights, which is in some ways kind of like the last frontier in terms of moral circle expansion? Like, you can go beyond that and talk about the rights of digital, or let's say artificial beings, which might, yeah, I mean, that's sort of more speculative, but also potentially also at least in principle, an area of concern. But yeah, I don't think anyone really knows exactly where things are going to go, and even less what we can do to change things, although people have ideas, as you and I know from some of the people that we were, you know, we're people in our networks who are trying to effect system change. And yeah, it's something I think about a lot as well, about how to have the most impact, even with a small organization. How can we do things that other people are not doing? How can we have some sort of margin? How can we have the greatest marginal impact? And I think that could be by trying to develop projects that are different from what other people seem to be doing. In some sort of, or something outlandish that other people might think is too impractical to do, but might actually be a way of changing people's views on a large scale. So I think we need kind of ambitious thinking, even if it's risky. I don't think we have an alternative but to take risks.
So from the perspective of animal justice, as we try to do everything in our power to create a vegan world, to transition towards a plant-based food system, at the same time, we are trying to balance out the huge crisis of the current animal suffering that is happening all around us with the potential of more suffering that would happen in the case of a collapse, and then all the existential risks that we've mentioned. That's already seems like it's very hard. It's a very hard position to handle mentally. Do you have any advice for activists that are working in this domain and are doing their best to?
Well, I think the advice can, and the one obvious suggestion, it actually comes just from animal activism itself. And I was sort of reminded of this by a comment somebody made a few days ago on a piece I wrote a couple of years ago called "Thriving in the Age of Factory Farming." And how do we allow ourselves to thrive knowing that there's so much suffering occurring in the world? And how do we thrive as activists? And my suggestion is that we need to, of course, we need to be aware of the suffering and even remind ourselves sometimes of it. Otherwise, we might risk losing some of the passion for activism. I mean, I find that every time I watch a video showing the abuse of animals, it fires up a little bit of rage in me, and definitely motivation to help try to do something about it. But at the same time, we need to protect ourselves, and we can't have that suffering in our minds all the time, because it can become depressing. It can become even demotivating if we feel that the problem is just too large, and it's not clear how we can really change things on a large scale. So there's some sort of balance we need between awareness and self-protection, self-compassion. So I think the same approach applies even when we're considering other things that are happening on our planet. And speaking with some of the people in the webinar last week that I mentioned on ethics and collapse, and with some of the other people in preparation for the webinar, even if you're expecting collapse to happen in the short term, you may take some very concrete measures to try to limit the damage or threats to yourself and your loved ones. But it's not necessarily the mindset you want to have all the time, every day. I mean, I'm not sure that it creates less suffering for yourself to be thinking all the time about bad things that might happen in the future. I think there are concrete things you can do to prepare, and while you can still try to thrive to the best you can and enjoy life at the moment. I think that's actually what James Lovelock said. It's another quote of his that I think I put in my first book. And he was very pessimistic about the prospect of avoiding collapse due to climate change. And he said, actually, maybe the only thing that we can do is try to enjoy life at the moment. Whether or not you share his pessimism, I think we still need that kind of balance in our lives. This balance between self-care and thriving on the one hand, and the other hand, trying to do as much as we can to change things. Just sort of focusing on things that we can't do anything about doesn't really help. And even if we can do something about it, that doesn't mean that it needs to dominate our thoughts all the time. So it's really a matter of self-care. It's a matter of what kinds of thoughts you allow into your awareness and how often.
Mm-hmm. So my question and what I'm trying to determine is, how do we keep the balance between, first of all, not having burnouts? Like burnouts are something that are there for lots of activists who are trying their best to create a better world and deal with the fact that from some perspective, it seems as if we can't do something about it. Then again, if we were really organized and we were really united and had a coherent movement, we could do something about it. So where is the balance between trying really, really hard in order to make a difference versus enjoying life? So how do we properly balance this as individuals?
Yeah.
And I guess right after that, we could also go, what can we do because after we are personally balanced, how do we bring that in perspective so that we do make the greatest change together? So we could maybe talk about some system change strategies or what you've been thinking.
Yeah. Okay, first of all, in terms of balance, if you want to take an ethical perspective on the balance, and you're really trying to have as much impact as possible, if you're really looking at it from the point of view of an agent who wants to be as effective as possible, then the balance you want is just going to be the minimum amount of thriving you need to continue to be sustainably effective as an activist. So from that perspective, all the enjoyment you have of life is only instrumentally valuable for your effectiveness as an activist. And that, that's one perspective that can be defended. Convinced that in itself is sustainable as a model, because people at least like to feel that their lives have value for their own sake. And I'm not talking in some sort of ethical sense here, but just that I think most of us would like to feel that there's more to our existence on this planet than only being activists, that we can enjoy ourselves in the moment and just enjoy that without thinking, okay, I'm recharging my battery so I can be a better activist, which of course is also true. So I don't think there's any one clear answer to what the ideal balance is, but I think one way of avoiding burnout is just to make sure that you're doing what you need to look after yourself as a human being with needs. I think it's also, I mean, even if we think about it in terms of valuable for its own sake, and again, I don't mean in an ethical sense, but that we just approach it with the idea that I have a right to thrive as well. That in itself is a more attractive model for activism than one that looks at us all as simply agents and who don't have a right to enjoy ourselves more than necessary. I think it's more sustainable, and I think I mean, not just for activists, for the world as a whole, we're more likely to get people on board with our vision if we don't just focus on the suffering as something that we want to get away from, but also focusing on thriving and bliss as things that we want to move towards. It's just basic human psychology. Having something inspiring that we can work towards that will also contain or also be not have the things that we don't want, mainly suffering. So, I mean, that's my simple answer, I guess, about how we should approach the whole idea of balance. And I can imagine that a lot of activists are so. The problem with activism is that people are very aware of the truth. It's much easier not to be an activist. Obviously, it's much easier to just enjoy life, enjoy pleasures, and eat whatever you want in restaurants, and not try to change legislation anywhere. But people who are very aware of the reality of suffering often have a very strong motivation, but that motivation if not sort of tempered a little bit with self-care, as you said, can lead to burnout. So I think it's really important that people look after themselves as well, and don't feel guilty by giving themselves a bit of space to breathe, even to put aside the suffering a little bit from time to time, as move it out of their awareness occasionally. It's a bit of a paradox, to get into a state of mind where the world seems beautiful and nature is beautiful and the birds are singing and there's so much natural beauty, and also to be aware that all this nature, within nature, there's a lot of suffering going on as well, and hidden away from view from ordinary citizens, or horrible things are going on to billions of sentient beings, and in some sense, it's I'm always wary of drawing analogies to atrocities committed against humans, but there are obvious parallels, and the kinds of things that we tolerate as a society are just absolutely awful, and so it's normal. If you thought of what's going on with non-human animals today, you could consider it sort of a wartime situation where wartime measures are needed. But it's so entrenched in society, and society is the laws of society are so much built around, so much focused on humans, and so neglectful of non-human animals, that we need to be in it for the long run. And so while it's totally understandable that activists will be focused even to the point of burnout on activism, which I totally admire, we need to look after ourselves as well, and be able to enjoy the beauty that's out there, even knowing that there's suffering existing alongside. There's some more to your question before. Maybe you want to.
Well, just to summarize, so it sounds like we really need to be able to hold the polarized view that life is beautiful, and actually even care about the beauty and nature for its sake, and at the same time realize that there's a lot of suffering that we do need to do something about it. So we need to hold those two polarized perspectives at the same time as much as possible in order to keep the right balance. My other question was,
and I just want to maybe,
go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify. I'm not saying, as you know, I'm not saying that the happiness justifies the suffering. Obviously, I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just saying that given the situation that we didn't choose, that we're born into this world that contains all the suffering, and we're trying to do something about it, we need personal balance.
Yeah, we need the capacity to see the light for which we are working and try to bring more of it. My other question goes into the external dimension and in the work that we do in order to create a better world. So what are all the theories of change that you think have the most potential? So you mentioned something before. You said as a small organization, we can concentrate on what is not being done. Now, as you know, with Vegan Option Canada, we are a small organization. At the same time, Vegan Option Canada is involved in the Plant-Based Transition Coalition, where there's a lot of organizations together who could concentrate on a lot of things. Were they to mobilize together? Were they to organize together? So that's where my question is. How can we organize together, and on what shall we focus together first? Because obviously within the movement ecology, everything is important at some point, But given where we're at today, with the potential of collapse happening soon and perhaps washing away everything that we've been working on, how can we make the most progress before it happens? What is the most progress? How can we combine different theories of change? So what are some of the strategies that you've been thinking about? Like, what thoughts do you have, advice do you have from the perspective of where we act? So we've discussed how to act in a healthy way. Now, what do we do when we act? Like, what are some potentials depending on, okay, not everyone does the same thing, not everyone has alignment towards doing the same thing, but what are some of the most effective things?
Yeah, it's a pretty important question, and it's not so easy to answer. But maybe to start with, if you're talking specifically about the plant-based transition coalition, which I guess you could say has defined objectives. I mean, it's not it's narrower than
Yes,
global systemic change and ethical governance. I mean, it's right. So, and it's focused, at least at the moment, specifically on Canada, with the idea of expanding, if that's my current understanding.
Yes, Canada, North America, and it is a food system change towards a plant-based system.
Yeah. So it's, these are much more specific objectives. And I mean, really, the idea is how to help other organizations different organizations within the coalition to work more effectively. And I think one of the most useful functions that the coalition can serve as is as a source of information. I mean, I know you've done a questionnaire and people were asked, what they think would be how the coalition would most serve them. But to provide sources of information about what is really known in terms of animal advocacy, about what the most effective strategies are, because there is research out there, and I think it's sometimes hard to keep track of everything that's being about everything that's being produced. But to have some sort of common ground on things like advocacy strategies, which essentially the organizations within the coalition are advocacy and education organizations. So common sort of a common knowledge base about what works effectively, general sharing of tools, of educational tools, and avoiding overlap of use of resources, so having sort of functions that can serve everybody, all the other organizations. I mean, it's really a way of working together, having a group of organizations work more effectively together and share know-how. That's really how I see the major function of the coalition. I know you like to use the word common wisdom, not common wisdom. What's the term you use?
Collective intelligence.
Collective intelligence, right? Sorry. This idea of people coming together and share, but it has to be done in some sort of structured way, so that there is some sort of a common knowledge base and people have access to it. I mean, I think if not sort of done properly, it can just. I think, as I told you at the beginning of the project, that it could lead to just more sort of bureaucracy, more meetings. So there has to be something very tangible in what comes out of it, and it should actually serve people and reduce the amount of time they need to spend on things, let's say, that other people are doing, to free them up to not just time-wise, but also help guide people to be more effective. If you're talking more broadly about systemic change and the approaches, I mean, I've watched some of Daniel Schmachtenberger's videos. I know you've watched many of them, because he is one of those unique thinkers that takes a very broad perspective on our whole situation, but also fills in that perspective with a lot of fine detail, and is able to communicate his insights in a very sort of elegant and accessible way. I don't know too many other people who have this kind of vision of actually trying to shape some sort of cultural change in the world with a very sort of solid foundation of assumptions about how the world works. And I know that a lot of his focus is, I mean, you're more familiar than I am because of your own work. But I mean, basically, the idea is to improve the way that people make sense of the world. I mean, it's about sense making. The way I understand it, well, it's basically how he's described the project himself. It's about educating people on a large scale so that they have the insights with which to make essentially political decisions. I mean, the whole idea being that in a that if we want governments to, if we entrust governments with law enforcement, we still need people to rein in the government or to exert control over the government, and that needs to be done in ideally by people that understand how systems work, that understand everything, all the key things that need to be understood. So yeah, if you're thinking about on a large scale, I mean, it's really, I mean, at least from his theory of change goes through widespread education. I mean, I don't disagree with him that this is a potentially key leverage point, if you like. I tend to put, I'm not saying this is necessarily an intellectual decision or just something that I feel intuitively, but it's probably some combination. I feel that a key factor is trust, and trust determines whether people will listen to you or not. But it's sort of circular, because people will trust you if they are given reason to believe that you're telling the truth. But it's not just that, it's that you're telling the truth, but that you also have people's well-being in mind. So if people feel that you can be trusted to tell the truth, and you can be trusted to try to find a way to meet their needs, they will tend to respect what you say. They will tend to respect the sources of information that you provide them. And this is perhaps a slightly complementary approach to that of Schmachtenberger and the Consilience Project. I'm not familiar enough with all the details of the Consilience Project, but I would say that finding a way of establishing trust between people, and not just people who are already politically aligned, but especially between people who have been polarized. I think that's one of the keys to instituting legislation that will ultimately be more protective of non-human animals as well. If people feel that it's just sort of the lefties against the right-wingers, it would just be a continuation of sort of tribal warfare, even if it's exercised politically. If it's more of a sense of a shared concern for the well-being of all, then there will be more of a chance to listen to argumentation. And I'm not saying this is like the one key to protecting animals from torture, because obviously there are many other strategies that are important. Just widespread education of the public, is probably the most direct approach. But in the long run, if we want to maintain if we want to stabilize some sort of future for our planet where ethics dominates in governance, we need to establish better mechanisms of trust building. I don't know exactly what they are, but I think it goes through changing our institutions so that the trust building is actually institutionalized, so that people have a chance to meet people from, so that there are actual structured ways for people to have discussions with people from different backgrounds with very different views. That these kinds of meetings can be scaled up or multiplied. So obviously, as we've talked about, the citizens' assemblies are a relatively new format of decision making that is often done sort of in parallel to the sort of more the parliamentary model, but can be mandated by a government. And it's a chance for people from different backgrounds who are not otherwise politically involved or have a political career, but to meet, to listen to experts and discuss and vote. And that's a process that seems to hold a lot of promise and has been used successfully. So that's a way of making decisions using ordinary people. But I think we need to find ways of involving entire populations somehow in the process of trust building, not just the people that we happen to be able to gather into a room, selected from the whole population, but in the same way that there's, let's say, this ambition on the Consilience Project to educate people about a whole range of topics, I think even more fundamentally is to get people to listen to one another respectfully, and even just if we can have discussions where we may disagree on the outcomes or on the approaches, but we can start it with I care about your well-being, you care about my well-being. Okay, that's a pretty nice way to start. Basically within a framework of nonviolence. So again, this isn't. I don't have any sort of very concrete path forward to get there, but I think we can plant the ideas in the minds of many more people and make it easier for people who want to establish local initiatives to do so, while also potentially aiming higher up at the sort of highest level structures of government, although that's not necessarily where things change the most quickly. There's only, I think maybe another point worth mentioning is that sometimes we feel like there's some sort of lever by which, if we just figure things out, we can change everything. And I know I'm very much prone to that kind of thinking as well. I think it will serve. I think there's another argument for balance, a balance between ambition and really trying to do things that other people might think are impossible or impractical. And at the same time, exercising a certain amount of, I don't know if I'd call it humility, but at least awareness that there are limits to what we can do. We find ourselves in this situation that has, we can blame whoever we want. We can blame the system, we can blame capitalism, we can blame consumerism, we can blame technology. But it really is, we are just parts of a complex system, and there's no single person, and it's not Bill Gates, it's not Elon Musk, who are ultimately to blame, whether we like them or not for whatever they're doing. A lot of people seem to like, most people seem to like pointing fingers, and it feels better when you can point to a particular sort of locus of causation. But we're all part of a system, and the system has its roots in human psychology, which is a result of evolution. And instead of blaming evolution. It feels better to blame something much more concrete, you know, sometimes one individual person. But we're a product of this whole process. And we find ourselves here trying to sort things out and change the way everything works. And it's a hard problem to put it mildly. And I think, but we have this desire, we see how much suffering there is, and we think, well, there must be a way of doing something about it. And maybe there is, but I don't think it's going to be by working out every single variable and determine the value of every single important variable and running a model and determining, you know, this is what we need to do. I mean, and again, I am prone to that kind of thinking. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to do this a bit as well, because we can still have rough models might tell us, well, actually, there's a better chance of achieving some success if we do this rather than that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that we should be realistic as well about this approach, you know, giving us the result we want, because the world is just so complex. There's so many things we don't know, and there's just so many interactions and unknowns. So we're really just doing the best that we can, but we can try to make educated guesses about where to put our energy. And I fall back on the sort of basic ideas about truth and love. And you could say it in other ways. You could talk about rationality and intuition. You could talk about the head and the heart, wisdom and compassion. Basically, getting the truth out there about the reality of our world, including the reality of the subjective experience of sentient beings, which is the most important reality that there is. You know, the fundamental phenomenology of sentient beings, and the truth about, well, yeah, the truth about how everything works and what are the key drivers of the world as it is, and then this sort of basic feeling of trying to empathize with those who are suffering in different ways and those who have different views from us. And you know, love and empathy, they're talked about a lot. They're the words that empathy, especially empathy and compassion, we read about them a lot more. But I don't think we experience them that often when it comes to online debates and you know, political posts. You know, there's still very much this idea of us versus them. And I'm not even saying that approach isn't also valid. You know, if you're trying to bring down a regime that is inherently evil, I mean, when I say evil, I mean that, you know, killing and torturing, let's just say people for the moment, and getting away with it. I mean, you know, there are good reasons to, well, in some cases, you know, even nonviolence may not be the best approach. You know, if you're dealing with completely non-ethical governance. But my point is just that more generally, if we can achieve more civility, more empathy for the people who have very different views, who may even have views that espouse violence, they're all ultimately human beings that are trying to meet their needs, and for one reason or another, because of their environment, the environment that they find themselves in, they hold certain views, and you know, each of us would probably hold similar views if we were in the same kind of environment. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but I'm just saying that, you know, when people criticize, let's say, the citizens of one country for, you know, things that happened in the past, I'm not sure that's a very effective approach. I mean, I think we will find solutions to a lot of our problems by exercising more empathy and trying to find solutions that meet everyone's needs rather than are based on, you know, retributive justice and the sense of revenge and anger at things that happened in the past. I think more understanding and empathy and less blaming will probably lead to better solutions.
Thank you. That's a beautiful note to end on. Truth and love. So there's a lot of more things that we could discuss and lots more questions that I have for you, but perhaps those could wait for another time. Any last words, thoughts that you want to leave us with for the organizations within the Plant-Based Transition Coalition, for their activists, for the members of Vegan Option Canada? Anything that you want to close on?
I don't have any specific thing to say other than I have a huge amount of admiration for everybody who's working on behalf of non-human animals, and I really hope we can have some success in the coming years and move things forward and show people that you can have a great lifestyle and eat lots of great, nutritious, tasty food without having to harm animals. I think we all know that, but I think I'm cautiously optimistic that we can convince many more members of the general public that that is true. So I wish all of us energy and success.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for the discussion and for accepting the role of advisor and for the past, current, and future advice. And thank you very much for all the work that you do in order to alleviate suffering.
Well, the thanks goes back to you because I admire all the work that you're doing and your passion and yeah, all the experience you've gained by working for various different organizations and your commitment to the cause. So it's always a pleasure collaborating with you and talking with you. So thanks very much.
Thank you.